The sky over Havenwood had the color of a day-old bruise. It was a strange, unsettling yellow-gray that promised nothing good. The air was thick, heavy, a wet blanket that muffled sound and made every breath feel like a chore. People in the small, remote town looked up, squinted, and then hurried on with their business, an unspoken anxiety settling deep in their bones. They knew this kind of sky. They knew the stillness that came before the violence. In a small cottage at the edge of the woods, where Willow Creek ran shallow and clear, a little girl named Lily sat on the floor, meticulously arranging a set of wooden soldiers. Her grandfather, George, sat in his worn armchair, cleaning a pair of old binoculars. He was a man carved from oak and memory, his face a roadmap of a long life, his hands still steady despite the tremble of age. His eyes, though faded, held a sharp, clear light. "See this one, Grandpa?" Lily held up a soldier with a painted-on mustache. "He's the general. He's very brave." George smiled, a slow creasing of his weathered features. "Every good unit needs a brave general, little bug. But the bravest ones know when to take cover." He glanced out the window at the bruised sky. The wind was beginning to whisper through the pines, a low, mournful sound that was growing in pitch. A warning. The creek, usually a gentle murmur, was already running faster, its voice deepening. The stillness of the afternoon had broken. It was replaced by a sense of urgency, a feeling that the world was holding its breath, about to be plunged underwater. George set the binoculars down. "All right, Lilybug. I think it's time we check the storm shutters." But time had already run out. The whisper became a howl. The sky, once bruised, turned a furious churning black. The first drops of rain weren't drops at all. They were pellets, thrown from the heavens with malicious force, striking the roof like a drum roll announcing a war. Then the drum roll became a roar. The world outside the windows dissolved into a gray, liquid chaos. On the other side of Havenwood, perched on a low rise that overlooked the town, sat a long black building with no windows on its face. A single sign, forged from iron and rust, depicted a snarling hound's head. This was the clubhouse of the Iron Hounds Motorcycle Club. To the people of Havenwood, it was a fortress of menace, a place of loud noises and louder men. They were a blight, a collection of scarred, leather-clad misfits who kept to themselves and were spoken of only in hushed, fearful tones. Inside, the world was dry and warm. The air smelled of old leather, motor oil, and stale beer. Holt, the club's president, sat at a heavy wooden table, studying a map of the surrounding county. He was a man built like a mountain, with a graying beard and eyes that had seen too much. He didn't miss the way the building groaned under the assault of the wind. He didn't miss the sound of the rain, which was no longer just rain, but a solid sheet of water trying to beat its way inside. A massive man they called Bear slammed a fist on the table, making the map jump. "This ain't a squall, Holt. This is something else." Holt didn't look up from the map. "I know what it is." His voice was low and steady, a gravelly sound that commanded attention without ever needing to be raised. He traced a blue line on the map with a scarred finger. Willow Creek. It ran right past the old part of town, right past the cottage where an old friend lived. The storm was a living thing now. It was a beast of wind and water, clawing at the town, trying to tear it from its foundations. The power grid, old and poorly maintained, gave up with a final, flickering sigh. The clubhouse was plunged into darkness, save for the emergency lanterns that one of the members, Doc, immediately lit. The yellow glow cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, turning the men inside into hulking, monstrous shapes. They were monsters to the town. They were outcasts. They were the men that mothers told their children to avoid. But their code was simpler than anyone in Havenwood could ever understand. It was a code forged in firefights and forgotten places, a code that said you protect your own, you protect the weak, and you never, ever leave anyone behind. The water came first as a trickle, then a stream, then a river. It poured down the gentle slope of George's yard and began to lick at the porch steps. "Upstairs, Lily," he said, his voice calm, betraying none of the cold fear that was starting to grip his heart. He moved to the front door, pushing against it. It wouldn't budge. The pressure of the rising water was already too great. He saw it then, through the glass pane of the door. A log, torn from upstream, was careening down the newly formed river that had once been his street. It moved with impossible speed, a battering ram aimed directly at his small, fragile home. "Lily, get back!" The impact was a sickening crunch of splintering wood. The front wall of the cottage gave way, and the beast was inside. Icy, muddy water surged into the living room, knocking George from his feet. It swirled around the furniture, lifting chairs, tossing the wooden soldiers Lily had so carefully arranged. He gasped, sputtering as his head went under. He fought his way back to the surface, his old body screaming in protest. The water was up to his chest. He saw Lily on the stairs, her eyes wide with terror. "Grandpa!" "Stay there," he commanded, his voice raw. He tried to move toward her, but the current was a powerful, unseen hand, pushing him, pulling him. Another surge of water poured through the broken wall, and it slammed him against the far side of the room. His head struck the stone fireplace, a flash of white-hot pain, and then the darkness began to creep in at the edges of his vision. "Grandpa!" Her voice sounded very far away. He fought to stay conscious, fought to keep his head above the filthy water. He had to protect her. He had to get her out. But his body was failing him. The darkness was winning. Lily watched in horror as her grandfather went limp, his body held afloat only by the debris in the churning water. The general on the floor was gone, swept away. All the soldiers were gone. She was alone. The water was now covering the third step, then the fourth. It was climbing toward her. Panic gave way to a strange, cold clarity. Her grandfather had always told her stories, stories of brave men, stories of his friends from long ago, men who rode loud machines and wore leather vests with a snarling dog on the back. He called them his brothers. He said they were the most dependable men he ever knew. He had a picture of them, tucked away in a dusty photo album, young men full of fire and rebellion. One of them looked like the big, scary man she sometimes saw at the general store, the one with the gray beard. She knew where they were. Their big black house was on the hill. The hill wasn't flooding. If she could get out, if she could get to the hill, she could find them. Her grandfather said they never left a man behind. He was one of them. She had to believe that meant something. She scrambled up the rest of the stairs and ran to the back bedroom window. It overlooked the yard, which was now a swirling vortex of brown water. But the back of the house was on slightly higher ground. The water there was only up to the porch. Beyond that, the woods sloped upward, toward the hill, toward the black house. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she shoved the window open. The wind and rain tore at her, a physical blow. She didn't hesitate. She climbed out onto the narrow roof of the back porch, her small feet slipping on the wet shingles. She half slid, half fell into the churning water below. It was cold, a shocking, brutal cold that stole her breath, but it was only waist-deep here. She could stand. She could move. She fought her way through the current, grabbing onto the trunk of a pine tree to steady herself. She looked back once at the broken house, at the dark window she had just escaped. "I'll be back, Grandpa," she whispered into the storm. "I'll bring help." Then she turned and began the long, impossible climb up the hill. She was a small girl against a giant, angry storm, a single point of determined light in a world of raging darkness. She was going to find the monsters on the hill. She was going to ask them to save her hero. The journey was a nightmare of sucking mud, whipping branches, and blinding rain. Her small legs ached, her lungs burned, but she didn't stop. The image of her grandfather, limp in the water, was burned into her mind. It was the only fuel she had. Every step was a prayer. Every fallen log she scrambled over was a testament to a love so fierce it defied the storm itself. Finally, she saw through the sheets of rain. The long black building. Lights glowed from within, a warm, yellow promise. A line of massive motorcycles was parked under an overhang, gleaming and silent, like sleeping iron beasts. This was the place the town feared. For her, it was the only place that held any hope. She stumbled across the gravel lot and threw herself at the heavy wooden door. Her first knock was too weak, lost in the roar of the wind. She balled up her tiny frozen fist and pounded again, and again, using every last ounce of her strength. She screamed, her voice a thin, reedy sound against the storm's fury. "Help! Please, help me!" Inside, the low rumble of conversation stopped. Every head turned toward the door. Holt was on his feet in an instant. "Who in the hell?" Bear moved to the door, his massive frame blocking out the lantern light. He drew the heavy bolt and pulled the door inward. And there she stood. A tiny, drenched, shivering child, her face pale, her eyes enormous and filled with a desperate, terrified plea. She looked like a half-drowned kitten. The clubhouse fell into a complete, profound silence. The only sound was the howling of the wind outside and the soft dripping of water from the little girl's clothes onto the wooden floor. The men of the Iron Hounds, men covered in tattoos and scars, men who had faced down rival gangs and hostile cops, stared in stunned disbelief. Lily looked up at the giant of a man blocking her way, then past him at the room full of shadows and intimidating figures. Fear warred with determination on her small face. She took a shuddering breath, her voice barely a whisper. "Please," she said, her teeth chattering. "You have to help him. My grandpa, he's trapped." That whisper cut through the silence like a razor. It landed in the center of the room and shattered the hardened exteriors of every man there. Holt moved forward, his heavy boots making no sound on the floor. He didn't loom over her. He did something no one in Havenwood had ever seen him do. He knelt. He got down on one knee, bringing his weathered face level with hers. His voice, when he spoke, was impossibly gentle. "Who's your grandpa, little one?" Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back began to stream down her face, mingling with the rain. "His name is George," he said. "He said you were his brothers." The name hit the room like a lightning strike. George. Old Man George. A founding member, a legend from the club's early days, before most of them were even patched in. He'd retired years ago, choosing a quiet life after his wife passed. They all knew him. They all respected him. He was Iron Hound's royalty. Holt's gentle expression hardened into one of granite resolve. He looked from Lily's terrified face to the faces of his men. He saw the same look in every single eye. There was no discussion. There was no debate. There was no hesitation. The code was the code. He placed a hand on Lily's shoulder, his touch firm and reassuring. "We're coming, little one," he said. "We're going to bring your grandpa home." He looked up at Bear. "Get her warm. Raven, take care of her." He stood, his full height seeming to fill the room. "The rest of you, gear up. Doc, grab the emergency kit. Crow, I need eyes. Find us a route. We're going in." The clubhouse, once a place of quiet waiting, erupted into a flurry of controlled, purposeful action. The men moved with the practiced efficiency of a military unit. Leather vests were shrugged on. Heavy boots were pulled tight. Ropes, flashlights, and tools were gathered. This was no longer a motorcycle club waiting out a storm. This was a rescue team on a mission. The storm had taken one of their own, and the Iron Hounds were about to prove that nothing, not wind, not water, not hell itself, could stop them from getting him back. If you believe that courage can be found in the most unexpected of places, then share this story so that others may see that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear leather. Raven, the club's only female member, a woman with a hawk's fierce eyes and a surprisingly gentle touch, swept Lily up in a thick wool blanket. She led the shivering girl toward the fire roaring in the stone hearth at the far end of the room. "You did good, kid," Raven said softly, her voice a low murmur against the rising clamor. "You did real good." Lily could only nod, the blanket a cocoon of impossible warmth against her frozen skin. She watched as the men prepared for war. They weren't fighting another club. They were fighting the world itself. The storm raged outside, a physical manifestation of nature's indiscriminate fury. It was an enemy without a face, without a weakness, an antagonist that could not be reasoned with or intimidated. Holt stood over the map table again, this time with Crow at his side. Crow was leaner than the others, his movements quick and silent like the bird he was named for. He was the club's scout, the one who knew every back road, every hidden trail, every forgotten logging path for 100 miles in any direction. "The main road is a river," Crow stated, his finger tracing a thick red line on the map. "Bridge over Willow Creek is probably gone by now. No vehicle is getting through. We don't need a vehicle, Holt said. His eyes narrowed in concentration. We need a path. George's place is here. He tapped a spot on the map, isolated and dangerously close to the creek's floodplain. The water's coming from the north. The whole basin is flooding. We can't go head on. The antagonist, the storm, seemed to answer him. A deafening crack of thunder shook the entire building, so powerful it felt as though the hand of God had slammed down on the roof. The lanterns flickered wildly. The wind shrieked, its voice rising in pitch, a taunt and a challenge. It was asserting its authority, reminding them of their fragility. It underestimated their resolve. It underestimated their bond. There's the old ridge trail, Crow said, his finger moving to a series of faint dotted lines that snaked through the hills behind the town. It's high ground. It'll be a muddy mess, treacherous as all hell. Trees down for sure, but it stays above the floodplain. It'll get us to the high ground behind his cottage. How close? Close enough. Maybe a quarter-mile of flooded ground to cross from the trailhead. It's our only shot. Holt nodded. That's the route. He turned to the rest of the club. Listen up. We go on foot. Ridge Trail. It's gonna be ugly. We take the inflatable raft. Bear, you and Gunner carry it. We'll need it for the last stretch. Doc, you're with me. Everyone else, stay here. Keep this place secure. Keep her safe. He jerked his chin toward Lily, who was now sipping a mug of hot cocoa by the fire, her wide eyes tracking their every move. There was a low grumble of protest from the men who were being told to stay behind. No one wanted to be left out. Leaving a brother in trouble went against every instinct they had. Those are orders, Holt said, his voice leaving no room for argument. A small, fast team has the best chance. The rest of you are the reserve. If we're not back in 3 hours, you come after us. Understood? A collective understood rumbled through the room. It was the sound of loyalty. It was the sound of trust. The storm was their opponent, and it was a formidable one. It threw everything it had at them. The wind tried to push them back. The rain tried to blind them, and the ground itself seemed to conspire against them, turning to a slick, grasping mud that tried to steal their boots with every step. But they were relentless. They were a force of nature in their own right. Holt led the way, a powerful LED flashlight cutting a path through the maelstrom. Doc was right behind him, a heavy medical pack strapped to his back. Bear and Gunner followed, the heavy deflated raft slung between them, moving with a strength that seemed inhuman. Crow was everywhere at once, scouting ahead, then falling back, his movements economical and sure-footed even on the treacherous terrain. This was the unmasking of the storm's power. It wasn't just rain and wind, it was a chaotic, violent assault. Trees, ancient and mighty, groaned under the strain, their roots giving way in the saturated earth. One came crashing down just yards in front of them, its fall a deafening explosion of splintering wood. They didn't even flinch. They simply found a way around it and kept moving. They were utilizing skills the storm could not account for. Holt's time in the military had taught him how to read a chaotic environment, how to lead men through hell. Doc, a former combat medic, knew how to prepare for the worst, his pack containing everything from tourniquets to thermal blankets. Bear's raw, brute strength was a tool more effective than any machine for clearing debris from their path. And Crow, he was their secret weapon. He saw the path where others would see only an impassable tangle. He read the landscape, the flow of water, the stability of the ground. He was the one who found the critical piece of information that would shatter the storm's blockade. "Here!" he yelled over the roar of the wind, pointing his light downward. "The trail's washed out ahead, but this game trail cuts down. It's steeper, but it will take us right where we need to go." It was a path almost invisible to the untrained eye, a slight depression in the forest floor. To Crow, it was a highway. This was the moment the tables turned. The storm had presented them with an impassable obstacle, and they had simply refused to acknowledge it. They made their own path. The antagonist's composure began to break. The storm, as if enraged by their progress, intensified its assault. The rain came down in horizontal sheets, driven by hurricane-force winds. Lightning began to tear the sky apart, striking the ridge around them with terrifying frequency. Each flash illuminated a scene of pure, primordial chaos. Each crack of thunder was a roar of fury. The mask of a simple storm had slipped. This was a killer. It was actively trying to stop them. But for the men of the Ironhounds, it only strengthened their resolve. They had a child's promise to keep. They had a brother to save. They pushed onward, their faces set like stone, their movements economical and driven by a single, unwavering purpose. They were a small band of brothers against a titan, and they would not be broken. They were closing in. They could hear it now, beneath the roar of the storm, the deeper, angrier sound of the floodwaters. They broke through the tree line and stopped, the sight before them stealing their breath. The valley below was gone. In its place was a vast, churning lake of brown water, filled with the debris of ruined homes and shattered lives. The tops of telephone poles were barely visible, and there, in the middle of it all, was the roof of a small cottage, an island in a world of destruction. A single faint light flickered in an upstairs window. "He's still in there," Doc said, his voice tight. Holt didn't waste a second. "Inflate the raft, now!" Bear and Gunner worked with frantic speed, their powerful hands pulling the cords on the CO2 canisters. The raft hissed to life, expanding into a sturdy vessel of bright orange against the gray devastation. This was it, the final push, the moment of victory or defeat. They launched the raft into the turbulent water, the current immediately grabbing it, trying to tear it away. Bear, a man the size of a small car, held the rope with one hand, his boots digging into the mud, acting as a human anchor. "I need 2 men in the raft," Holt commanded. "Doc, you're with me. Crow, you stay with the rope. You're our lifeline. Bear, Gunner, you're the anchor. Don't let go, no matter what." Holt and Doc climbed into the raft, grabbing the small paddles. The current was a living monster, pulling them, spinning them. Every dip of the paddle was a battle. Debris, planks of wood, a child's bicycle, pieces of shattered lives littered their path like mines. They were physically neutralizing the storm's ultimate weapon, the flood. They were moving through the heart of its power, defying it with nothing more than a rubber boat and unbreakable will. Lightning split the sky directly overhead, and in the blinding flash, Holt saw a face in the upstairs window of the cottage. It was George. He was alive. "Faster!" Holt roared, digging his paddle deeper, his muscles screaming in protest. They were close now, so close. The cottage was groaning, the sounds of its imminent collapse audible even over the storm. The water was tearing it apart from below. They reached the side of the house, slamming into the wall with a jolt. Doc grabbed hold of the gutter, holding them steady while Holt used his flashlight to find a way in. The upstairs window was their only chance. "George," Holt yelled, his voice raw. "George, can you hear me?" The window scraped open. George's pale, haggard face appeared. He had a nasty gash on his forehead, but his eyes were clear. "Holt! Knew you'd come, you old bastard." "We don't leave family behind," Holt said, a grim smile touching his lips. "Can you climb out?" "My leg's busted," George coughed, a racking, watery sound. "I think it's broken." There was no time for a complex solution. The victory had to be decisive. It had to be now. "Doc, get ready to grab him. George, I'm coming up." Holt, a man well into his 50s, moved with the agility of a man half his age. He found a purchase on the windowsill and hauled his massive frame up and through the opening. He landed in ankle-deep water inside the bedroom. The floor was tilted at a sickening angle. He assessed the situation in a heartbeat. George was propped against a dresser, his left leg bent at an unnatural angle. He was going into shock. "All right, old man," Holt said, his voice softening. "Let's get you out of this mess." He carefully maneuvered George toward the window, ignoring the old man's sharp cries of pain. He was a dead weight, but Holt was driven by adrenaline and decades of loyalty. He lowered George out the window into Doc's waiting arms. Doc, with surprising strength, managed to pull him safely into the raft. "Got him!" Doc yelled. Just as Holt was about to climb out himself, the entire house shuddered violently. A sound like a freight train filled the air as the downstream wall collapsed completely. The floor beneath Holt dropped away, and he was plunged into the raging water that had filled the house. "Holt!" Doc screamed. For a heart-stopping moment, he was gone. Then his head broke the surface. He was a strong swimmer, but the current inside the collapsing house was a death trap. He fought his way back to the window, his lungs burning. He clawed his way out and fell into the raft, gasping for air. The cottage, its structure fatally compromised, began to sink into the flood, consumed by the brown water. They had made it out with seconds to spare. Their victory was absolute. The storm had thrown its worst at them, and they had won. They had pulled their brother from the jaws of death. The journey back was just as perilous, but now they had a renewed sense of purpose. They had their prize. Crow, Bear, and Gunner hauled on the rope, their combined strength pulling the raft against the current, guiding it back to the relative safety of the shore. They dragged it onto the muddy bank, a small island of victory in a sea of destruction. Doc was already at work on George, cutting away his wet pant leg to reveal the badly broken bone. He quickly and efficiently applied a makeshift splint, his hands steady despite the chaos around them. He injected George with a dose of morphine for the pain. Holt stood and looked back at the spot where the cottage had been. There was nothing left but churning water. He felt a profound sense of exhaustion settle over him, but also a deep, bone-weary satisfaction. They had faced the beast and walked away. "Let's get him home," Holt said, his voice quiet. They began the long, slow journey back up the ridge, this time carrying their wounded brother on a makeshift stretcher. The storm still raged, but its fury felt spent. It had lost. They had proven that the bonds between men could be stronger than any force of nature, stronger than wind, stronger than water, unbreakable. When they finally emerged from the woods and saw the warm, yellow lights of the clubhouse, it was like seeing a lighthouse in the storm. The men who had been left behind rushed out to meet them, their faces etched with worry, which quickly turned to relief. They carried George inside and laid him on a makeshift bed near the fire. Raven was there in an instant, with blankets and hot broth. Lily, who had been pacing anxiously, ran to her grandfather's side. She saw his pale face, his closed eyes, the crude splint on his leg, and her face crumpled. Is he okay?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Doc put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "He's going to be fine, kid. He's tough. And he's got a busted leg, but we can fix that. You saved his life, Lily. You were brave enough to come get us." Lily looked from her grandfather to the exhausted, mud-caked faces of the men who had saved him. Holt, Bear, Doc, Crow. They looked like monsters. They were covered in mud and grime, their faces grim. But she saw them for what they were. They were knights, her knights. The immediate needs were being met. Safety, warmth, medical care. The circle of protection was complete. Lily sat by her grandfather, holding his hand, not letting go. She watched as Raven cleaned the gash on his forehead, her movements deft and gentle. She saw Bear, the most intimidating man she had ever seen, quietly place another log on the fire to make sure they stayed warm. Later, after George was stable and sleeping, Holt came and sat beside Lily. He looked tired, older than he had just a few hours before. The firelight played across the scars on his face. "Why did you do it?" Lily asked, her voice small. "Everyone in town is afraid of you." Holt looked into the flames for a long moment before he answered. "Your grandpa. He was one of the first. One of the men who started this club. He helped write our rules, even if they ain't written down anywhere." He pointed to the patch on his leather vest, the snarling hound's head. "This means something," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It means you don't run, you don't hide, and you don't ever turn your back on family. Doesn't matter if it's blood or the brother riding next to you, or his granddaughter." He looked at Lily, his eyes holding a sadness that seemed ancient. "A lot of us in here, we didn't have anyone looking out for us when we were kids. We know what it's like to be scared and alone. We made a promise to each other a long time ago. We'd be the guys who showed up. We'd be the ones who stood in the way when something bad was coming for someone who couldn't fight back." This was the core of their code, the theme of their lives. The wounded had become the healers. The outcasts had become the guardians. They had built their own family from the broken pieces of their lives, and its foundation was a fierce, unyielding loyalty. "George is family," Holt said simply. "That makes you family too. This is your home now, Lily, as long as you need it." The words settled over her, a blanket warmer than any wool. Family. Home. She looked around the room at the rough-hewn men talking in low voices, cleaning their gear, keeping watch. They were no longer scary, they were a wall, a fortress built to keep the storms of the world at bay. She was inside that fortress now. She was safe. In that moment, a bond was forged, silent and profound. The little girl who had braved a hurricane and the motorcycle club that the world had written off were now inextricably linked. Lily was formally adopted into the heart of the Iron Hounds, not by any paperwork or legal process, but by a shared trial of fire and water. She had her grandfather back, and she had gained a dozen new uncles, all of them scarred and scary, and all of them willing to ride into hell for her. She finally laid her head down on a cushion near the fire, her hand still holding her grandfather's, and slept for the first time since the sky had turned gray. 1 year passed. The scars on Havenwood from the Great Flood began to fade, covered over by new grass and fresh paint. The scars on the people, however, remained. But they were not all bad. Some were scars of memory, reminders of loss. Others were marks of change, symbols of a new understanding. The Iron Hounds Clubhouse was no longer just a black building on a hill. It was a landmark. The story of the rescue had spread through the town like wildfire. It had become a local legend, told and retold in the diner, the post office, and the general store. The fear the townspeople once felt had been replaced by something else: respect, awe, gratitude. Lily was no longer a terrified little girl. She was a vibrant, laughing child, the unofficial princess of the Iron Hounds. She spent her weekends at the clubhouse, doing her homework at the heavy wooden table where Holt planned his runs, or helping Raven in the small kitchen. She had a custom-made leather vest, a tiny one with no patches except for a single, beautifully embroidered lily on the back. She was thriving, surrounded by the fierce, unwavering love of her unconventional family. George had recovered, though he now walked with a cane and a pronounced limp. He had moved out of his ruined cottage and into a small apartment in town, but his real home was the clubhouse. He spent his days there, a revered elder statesman, telling stories of the old days to the younger members, his presence a living link to the club's honorable past. He and Holt would sit for hours, two old soldiers, content in the quiet company of a shared history. The clubhouse itself had changed. It was cleaner, brighter. There were flowers in a pot by the door, planted by Lily. And hanging in a place of honor above the stone fireplace, right next to the framed photos of fallen brothers, was a child's drawing. It was rendered in crayon, depicting a group of big, burly stick figures on motorcycles, standing in front of a small house while rain poured down. In the middle was a giant man with a gray beard, holding the hand of a small girl. Underneath, in wobbly letters, it said, "My Knights." That drawing symbolized the club's new identity in the town. They were still the Iron Hounds. They were still loud and rough, and they still didn't care what anyone thought of them. But they were also the guardians on the hill. When a family on the east side of town lost their home in a fire, the Iron Hounds were there before the Red Cross, with clothes and cash and a place to stay. When the town's youth center was in danger of closing, a mysterious, anonymous donation of exactly the right amount appeared in their bank account. Everyone knew where it came from. The club's reputation had been transformed, not by a change in them, but by a revelation of who they had been all along. The single act of kindness, the decision to ride into the storm for one of their own, had created a lasting, positive impact that rippled through the entire community. One crisp autumn afternoon, Holt stood on the clubhouse porch, watching Lily teach Bear how to play hopscotch on the asphalt. A pickup truck rumbled up the gravel drive. It was a farmer from a county over, a place hit hard by a summer drought. The man got out, his hat in his hands, his face etched with worry. I heard you folks help people," the farmer said, his voice hesitant. "Our town's well is dry. We've got folks who can't afford to buy water. We don't know what to do." Holt looked from the farmer's desperate face to the crayon drawing visible through the open doorway. He looked at Lily, laughing as the massive biker struggled with the small chalk squares. His expression didn't change, but a quiet understanding settled in his eyes. Their mission was not over. It would never be over. He nodded slowly. "Load up the trucks," he called back into the clubhouse. "We're going for a ride." The story of the Iron Hounds became a quiet lesson, a reminder that heroes are not defined by their appearance, but by their actions in the darkest of hours. It proves that the strongest families are often the ones we build ourselves, forged in loyalty and tested by fire. The world is full of storms, but it is also full of unexpected guardians, waiting for a cry for help. What does it truly mean to be a family? Is it about the blood you share, or the bonds you forge in the face of adversity? Let us know in the comments what you believe makes a true family, and remember that even in the fiercest storm, a single act of courage can be the light that guides everyone home.